Hello there.
I wanted to do a presentation for you about non-objective, non-representational sculptures. So in sculpture, in art, we're really used to seeing, and we expect to see something that is recognizable, something that, even if it's an abstraction of reality, it's something that relates to forms or objects or things that are found in the real world that we're used to seeing. A non-objective, non-representational sculpture is something that just tries to deal with form, pure form, and plays with the idea of trying to create a tabletop, pedestal top kind of a sculpture that is interesting to the viewer, that leads the viewer and the viewer's eyes around the sculpture with elements and transitions from one element to another, and that captures the imagination and the intrigue of the viewer. Are you still there? Because I don't see you on the front of my camera, so I'm going to look and see if you're on the back of my camera. The camera shut down for a minute. I hope that you're still new camera. Sorry about that. Anyway, here we go. So I have some examples of non-objective, non-representational things. I mean, basically, we're dealing with the idea of perhaps lines or planes or volumetric shapes in space, and that they would be in a sculpture organized in such a way that the lines or the planes will lead the eye of the viewer from one area of the sculpture into another area of the sculpture, and that they promote a sense of flow and movement through the sculpture, and that they are just interesting to look at and engaging for the viewer. We can also use negative spaces in the sculpture as a way of creating variety in the sculpture, of breaking up form, and allowing for flow to happen around perhaps a negative space. That's another way of playing with space and spatial relationships. They don't always have to be positive shapes. They can also be negative spaces in the sculpture too. So this is one example that I did. You're going to be playing with this for a week and developing a vocabulary of form. And perhaps the first kinds of form that you'll play with are lines or linear forms that move from one area of the sculpture to another. They start and they stop, in different kinds of forms, and they link things together so that the viewer's eye follows that line or that linear form from one area of the sculpture to the next. Other things that you can play with in sculpture are planes. This is a much larger, kind of a curving, planar surface in the sculpture. And it evolved over time, playing with form, trying to see if I could get some more variety in the sculpture. So we've got this thing, which is sort of a linear and planar form. From one edge, it's thin and works like a line. From another vantage point, it looks more like a plane, a curving plane in space connecting from one area of the sculpture to another. So whether it's a very large curving plane like this one, or a plane that's a little bit smaller, you can use planes also. We can also use shapes. Shapes can be large or small. This tends to be right here a spherical shape in the sculpture. It happens to be something where your eye is flowing across the piece and then stops and comes to rest on this thing because it has a different shape and it's very distinct. It has fairly strong transitions around it to kind of isolate it as a round shape. And it's not the only one in the sculpture. There's one over here. There's kind of a round spherical shape that kind of grows out of a linear or planar form. Another round spherical shape that might be like a transition in the middle of this kind of linear flowing area of the composition. We have round spherical shapes that sometimes work like an elbow or a kneecap or something that interrupts the flow and allows, the flow to happen from one area to another, and then pause or stop and then continue on. So we can work with and develop a vocabulary of form of lines and planes and shapes in the composition. I've got a couple more pieces to show you and talk about that. Here's a sculpture that does a similar kind of a thing with lots of negative spaces, lots of linear forms that sometimes get really wide and become a plane on one dimension or one perspective of it, while on another dimension or another viewing angle will become much more linear. But they can be both planar and linear forms in the sculpture. Lots of opportunity for negative space that punctuates the sculpture and penetrates the sculpture. And then these negative spaces also can have a shape to them, and that shape of the negative space can be repeated in the sculpture too. So we're just trying to find ways of engaging the viewer's eye, of creating bridges or perhaps diagonal movement around the sculpture that kind of helps the viewer get around the sculpture, go from one area to the next with a flowing line that makes you want to get up and really engage with the sculpture in a 360-degree way. Instead of sitting here with a turntable, when it's on a pedestal, you'll want to walk around the piece and see how it the forms flow, how shadows are cast, and how the light changes as you move around the piece inside of a room or even outside, perhaps in a sculpture garden. You don't have to use all of those kinds of ideas in a sculpture, and as a matter of fact, I would like it if you could limit your vocabulary of form perhaps to a certain number of forms. You might want to look up Jean Arp, or Hans Arp, was a sculptor working in the 1930s, primarily a surrealist sculpture, and worked with a lot of forms like this. He was interested in very sensual forms. He was interested in forms that related to the human body, but that were definitely abstracted enough that they were fairly non-objective, non-representational forms. But rounded, sensual kinds of volumetric forms in a sculpture can also work really nicely. Sometimes you can have pieces that kind of come up to a point or something, and then you actually have to kind of jump the gap, like a spark jumping the gap on a spark plug or something, getting from one area of the sculpture to another area of the sculpture, because we don't always complete the connection with a linear form or with a flowing form. Sometimes you can create tension in the piece and make it really interesting by making a gap that the viewer's eye has to jump. When you engage the viewer, the viewer has to do some of the work, some of the heavy lifting in trying to learn what the piece is about and navigating through the thing, especially if it's non-objective, non-representational. They have to spend time with it to try to figure out what's going on here, because it's not like an image where they can just have an aha moment and just, oh yes, I've seen that before, I know my way around this piece. With abstract pieces, sometimes you really have to spend a lot more time with them. When you get a hook like this that comes up to a point and a hook like this that comes to a point, sometimes they will call to each other and kind of create a sense of tension between them. The further away the points are, or the smaller that they are, the less tension that they create. But it's still noticeable that you can find these things that might actually be gesturing towards themselves or bending kind of towards themselves and creating this interior kind of reference towards the sculpture, which kind of helps create a sense of flow through the sculpture. I've got flow happening through all of these pieces all the way up to here, and then up to the top again, flow happening through these pieces because your eye connects the dots, and then up through here. So we're creating ways of making places for eye movement to happen in the sculpture and for the viewer's eye to be able to flow through the sculpture and connect up the various parts. Now, I've got a piece that I have just started as an example that I'm going to put up here on the sculpture stand. And this is where we start from. We're going to be taking that bag of clay and piling it up onto in an additive process way, and trying to pile it up, and at the same time trying to break up the sense of that block of clay that came in the bag, trying to open up negative spaces, trying to start to create a vocabulary of form in the piece so that it does create a sense of movement. There are different shapes in the piece that leads the viewer's eye in different places and in different ways around the sculpture. I do like to try to break up the piece as much as possible so that it doesn't feel like it's a monolithic thing, like a gravestone or a tree trunk just kind of growing out of the ground. It's kind of nice for it to have negative spaces, kind of breaking up some of it until it can maybe be sitting on like 3 points of contact on the ground, because 3 points of contact constitute a plane, and so for it to sit, on a tabletop or something, it needs